I should have known something was off about this job when they hired me on the spot. No background check, no references, just a handshake and a start date. But I needed the money, and 3 months in a fire tower sounded better than another summer bagging groceries at Henderson's Market. The drive up to Granite Peak took longer than I'd expected. My truck, a '96 Ford that had seen better decades, wheezed and rattled on the steep grades, but it made it. Always did somehow. The road twisted through dense pine forest, getting narrower with each mile until it was barely wide enough for one vehicle. I passed a few turnoffs that looked like they led to hiking trails, but mostly it was just trees and more trees. I'd never seen so much green in my life. Growing up in Millfield, you got used to wheat fields and the occasional cottonwood, but this was different. The forest stretched out in every direction, rolling hills covered in pine and fir that went on until they hit the mountains. Made me feel small in a way that wasn't entirely comfortable. The forestry station sat in a clearing about halfway up the mountain, just a single-story building with brown siding and a gravel parking lot. A few government vehicles were parked outside, and I could see a radio antenna poking up from the roof. I pulled up next to a green Forest Service truck and killed the engine. My truck gave one final shudder and went quiet. For a moment, I just sat there listening to the silence. No traffic, no voices, no machinery, just wind in the trees and the tick of my cooling engine. It was the kind of quiet you never got in town, even at 3 a.m. The woman who came out to meet me looked like she'd spent her whole career outdoors, probably mid-40s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a ponytail and the kind of tan you only get from years of actual work in the sun. Her uniform was crisp but practical, and she moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "You must be Lopez," she said, extending a hand. "Willow Alvarado, District Ranger." "Tommy," I said, shaking her hand. She had a firm grip, the kind that said she didn't have patience for nonsense. "Good. Let's get you briefed and up to the tower before it gets dark." She led me inside the station, which was about what I'd expected. Government-issue furniture, maps covering every wall, radio equipment, filing cabinets. The place smelled like coffee and old paper. Willow pulled out a thick folder and set it on the desk between us. "Your job's pretty straightforward," she said, flipping through pages. "Weather reports every hour during daylight, every 2 hours at night. Watch for smoke. If you see any, you call it in immediately with location and estimated size. Don't try to be a hero. Your job is to observe and report, nothing else." I nodded, scanning the paperwork she was showing me. Most of it was forms and procedures, the kind of bureaucratic stuff that made my eyes glaze over, but the important parts were simple enough. Watch for fires, report what I saw, don't do anything stupid. "Radio protocols all in here," Willow continued, tapping a laminated sheet. "Weather station's automated, but you'll need to take readings and call them in. Phone line's your backup if the radio goes down, which it does sometimes during storms." "How often do you get fires up here?" I asked. "Depends on the year. Last summer was pretty quiet, just a couple small ones that got put out fast. Year before that, we had a big one about 10 miles south that kept us busy for 3 weeks. She looked up from the folder. "Point is, you never know. That's why we need eyes up there." Made sense. I'd seen the news reports about wildfires in other parts of Montana, whole towns evacuated, thousands of acres burned. Not something you wanted to take chances with. "There's another tower about 15 miles north," Willow said. "Cedar Ridge. Guy named James Alvarez has been working that one for a few years. Radio contact between towers can be spotty depending on weather and atmospheric conditions, but you might hear from him occasionally." I made a note of that. It'd be good to know there was someone else out there doing the same job, even if I couldn't talk to him regularly. "Supplies get delivered every 2 weeks, Willow continued. "Food, propane, whatever else you need. Just make a list and leave it with your reports. Emergency helicopter landing zone is marked on your map, but hopefully you won't need that." She went through the rest of the procedures: how to test the equipment, what to do if the radio died, emergency protocols, standard stuff, mostly common sense. The job really was as simple as she'd made it sound. Sit in a tower, watch for smoke, make phone calls. Even I could handle that. 20 minutes later, we were back in our vehicles, heading up the mountain. The road got even narrower above the station, and steeper too. My truck protested the whole way, but Willow's Forest Service vehicle handled it like it was built for this kind of terrain, which it probably was. The tower appeared through the trees without much warning. One moment I was following Willow around a bend. The next, I was staring up at 70 feet of steel framework topped by a small glass-walled cabin. It looked like something out of a movie, all angles and girders against the sky. "Home sweet home," Willow said when we'd parked at the base. I craned my neck to look up at the cabin. It seemed impossibly high and impossibly small. The whole structure swayed slightly in the wind, which didn't exactly fill me with confidence. "It's safe," Willow said, noticing my expression. "Built to withstand hurricane-force winds. The movement's normal, it's designed to flex rather than break." That was reassuring, I guess. I grabbed my duffel bag and followed her to the base of the tower. The stairs were steel grating, the kind you could see through, which made the climb more interesting than I would have preferred. By the time we reached the top, my legs were burning and I was breathing hard. Willow, meanwhile, wasn't even winded. The cabin was bigger than it looked from the ground, but not by much. Maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, with windows on all sides and a narrow catwalk running around the outside. Inside, it was efficiently laid out like a ship's cabin. Bed against one wall, desk with radio equipment under the front windows, small kitchen area with a propane stove and mini fridge. Basic, but it had everything I'd need. "Firefinder's the most important piece of equipment you've got," Willow said, pointing to a circular device mounted in the center of the cabin. It looked like a compass with a rotating sight on top. You line up the smoke with the crosshairs, read the bearing and distance, and that tells you exactly where the fire is. She showed me how to use it, how to take weather readings, how to work the radio. The view from up there was incredible. Forest stretching to the horizon in every direction, mountains rising in the distance, the ribbon of road we'd driven snaking down through the trees. On a clear day, I could probably see 50 miles or more. "Questions?" Willow asked when she'd finished the tour. "I don't think so. Seems pretty straightforward." "It is. Just remember, you're the eyes and ears for this whole section of forest. People's lives and property depend on you spotting fires early." She headed for the stairs. "I'll check in by radio tomorrow morning. After that, you're on your own unless something comes up." I watched her climb down the tower and drive away, her truck disappearing into the trees. Then it was just me in the forest and 70 feet of empty air. The first week passed faster than I'd expected. I fell into the routine easily enough: wake up at dawn, start the weather reports, spend the day scanning the horizon with binoculars, make notes in the logbook. The work wasn't difficult, but it required attention. I had to actually look, not just go through the motions. A thin column of smoke could be easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, and by the time you noticed it, a small fire could have turned into something much bigger. The isolation didn't bother me as much as I'd thought it would. Growing up in Millfield, population 800 and shrinking, I was used to quiet. But this was different. In town, there was always something. Cars passing, dogs barking, the grain elevator running. Up here, there was just wind and birds, and the occasional rustle of something moving through the underbrush below. I spent my free time reading, working through a stack of paperbacks I'd brought from home. Mysteries, mostly, and a few science fiction novels. When I got tired of reading, I'd sit on the catwalk and watch the forest. Sometimes I'd see deer moving through the clearings, or hawks circling overhead. Once I spotted what might have been a bear, but it was too far away to be sure. The sunsets were incredible. From up there, I could watch the light change across the whole landscape, the mountains turning purple in the distance while the forest below faded to black. I'd never paid much attention to sunsets in town, too many buildings and power lines in the way. But up here, it was like having front row seats to something that happened every day but never got old. By the 8th day, I was starting to think this might be the best job I'd ever had. Sure, it was isolated, and sure, there wasn't much to do in the evenings besides read and listen to the radio. But the pay was decent, the work was easy, and I was saving money since there was nowhere to spend it. 3 months of this and I'd have enough for my first year of college, maybe more. That night I made myself dinner, canned chili heated on the propane stove, and settled in with a book. The sun had set an hour earlier, and the forest below was dark except for a few distant lights that might have been other fire towers or maybe just radio antennas. The silence was complete, the kind of deep quiet you only get in the middle of nowhere. At 9:30 the telephone rang. I wasn't expecting any calls. Willow had said she'd check in by radio, not phone, and I couldn't think of anyone else who'd have the number. For a moment I just stared at the old rotary phone sitting on the desk, its shrill ring cutting through the silence. I picked up on the 4th ring. Granite Peak Tower. Listen carefully. The voice was gravelly, urgent, like someone who'd been smoking for decades. There are 7 rules you need to follow. Your life depends on it. I assumed it was James Alvarez from Cedar Ridge Tower. Who else would be calling? But something about his voice made me uneasy. He sounded nervous, almost scared, and he was talking fast, like he didn't have much time. "I'm sorry. Who is this?" I asked. 7 rules, he continued, ignoring my question. "Write them down. Don't trust your memory." I grabbed a pen from the desk drawer and pulled out my logbook. Something about his voice made me want to follow his instructions, even though I still didn't understand what was happening. "All right," I said. "I'm ready." "Rule 1, he said, and I could hear him breathing heavily between words. "Never go outside between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. Stay in the tower. Lock the door." I wrote it down, word for word. The pen felt strange in my hand, heavier than it should have been. My handwriting looked shaky on the page. Rule 2. If you hear voices calling your name from the forest, don't answer. Don't look for the source. Cover your ears and wait for sunrise. This was getting weird. I kept writing, but my mind was starting to catch up with what I was hearing. These weren't normal fire tower procedures. This sounded like something out of a horror movie. Rule 3. If the radio starts broadcasting voices that aren't from other towers or the forestry station, turn it off immediately. Don't listen to what they're saying. I stopped writing for a second. "What kind of voices?" "Just write them down," he snapped. Rule 4. Never use the firefinder between midnight and 3 a.m. Keep it covered during those hours. The firefinder was just a compass with a sight on it. What could possibly be dangerous about using it at night? I wrote it down anyway, but I was starting to think this was some kind of elaborate joke. Maybe this was what they did to new guys. Get them all spooked their first week. Rule 5. If you see lights moving through the forest that don't match any known roads or trails, don't report them. Act like you didn't see anything. That one actually made me pause. Part of my job was to report anything unusual. Lights in the forest could mean campers in trouble, or poachers, or any number of things that the Forestry Service would want to know about. Rule 6. If someone approaches the tower at night claiming to be lost or injured, don't let them in. Don't go down to help them. Wait until morning, then call for assistance. I was definitely thinking this was a prank now. That rule went against every decent human instinct I had. If someone was hurt and needed help, I wasn't going to leave them outside all night. Rule 7. His voice got quieter, more urgent. If you break any of these rules, leave immediately. Don't pack. Don't call anyone. Just get in your truck and drive away. Don't come back. I finished writing and looked at what I'd put down. 7 rules that sounded like they came from some urban legend or creepypasta story. The kind of thing college kids told each other around campfires. "Look," I said, I don't know what kind of game this is, but this isn't a game. His voice cut through my words like a blade. I'm putting a copy under your door tonight. Follow them exactly, no matter what you think you know. Why would I need to? The line went dead. I sat there holding the phone, listening to the dial tone. After a few seconds, I hung up and immediately picked it back up to call him back. I didn't know the number for Cedar Ridge Tower, but I figured I could get it from the forestry station. I dialed 0 for the operator. Nothing, just dead air. I tried dialing the forestry station. The phone rang and rang, but nobody answered. Made sense, I guess. It was after 9:30 at night. Willow probably went home hours ago. I put the phone down and looked at the rules I'd written in my logbook. They looked even more ridiculous written in my own handwriting, like something a kid would make up to scare his friends. But James Alvarez hadn't sounded like he was joking. He'd sounded scared, really scared, and urgent, like he was running out of time to tell me these things. I read through the list again. Never go outside between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. Don't answer voices calling my name. Turn off the radio if it broadcasts strange voices. Don't use the fire finder between midnight and 3 a.m. Don't report mysterious lights. Don't help people who show up at night. And if I broke any of these rules, run. It was insane, all of it. I closed the logbook and tried to focus on my book, but I couldn't concentrate. Every few minutes I'd catch myself listening for sounds outside. The wind in the trees sounded different somehow, more deliberate, like it was trying to form words. I shook my head and forced myself to read. This was exactly what James wanted, wasn't it? To get me all paranoid and jumpy. Probably tomorrow he'd call back laughing, asking how I liked my first taste of tower life. Maybe this was some kind of tradition. Scare the new guy with ghost stories and mysterious rules. But if that was the case, why had he sounded so genuinely frightened? I read the same paragraph 3 times before giving up. I wasn't going to be able to focus on anything until I figured out what was going on. I decided to call the forestry station again in the morning and ask Willow about James Alvarez. Maybe she could explain what his deal was. I got ready for bed around 10:30, brushing my teeth at the small sink and changing into a t-shirt and sweatpants. The whole time, I kept thinking about those rules. They were stuck in my head now, repeating themselves over and over. Never go outside between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. Don't answer voices calling your name. Don't listen to strange radio broadcasts. I climbed into bed and tried to push the thoughts away. It was just a prank. Had to be. People didn't make rules like that for real jobs. The Forestry Service wouldn't hire someone who believed in supernatural nonsense. I was almost asleep when I heard footsteps on the stairs outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps climbing the metal grating. Each step rang out clear in the night air. Someone was coming up to the tower. I sat up in bed and checked the clock. 10:57. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I waited for a knock, but it never came. Just silence. I got out of bed and walked quietly to the door. There was no peephole, no way to see who was out there without opening it. I pressed my ear against the wood and listened. Nothing. "Hello?" I called out softly. No answer. I waited another minute, then carefully turned the door handle and opened it just a crack. The catwalk was empty. Nobody there. But on the metal grating by my feet was a manila envelope. I looked around the catwalk, then down at the stairs. Nobody in sight. Whoever had brought this was already gone. They must have climbed back down while I was getting out of bed. I picked up the envelope and went back inside, locking the door behind me. The envelope wasn't sealed. Inside was a single sheet of white paper with 7 rules typed in an old-fashioned font. The same rules James had told me over the phone, word for word, but seeing them typed out like this made them feel more official somehow, more real, like they weren't just the ramblings of someone trying to scare me. At the bottom of the page, in different ink, someone had written, "These saved my life. Follow them. J.A. J.A. James Alvarez." I read through the rules twice, comparing them to what I'd written in my logbook. They were identical. Every word exactly the same. The rational part of my mind was still insisting this was some kind of elaborate prank. Maybe James had a key to the tower. Maybe he'd climbed up while I was getting ready for bed and left this as part of his joke. But another part of me, a part I didn't want to acknowledge, was starting to wonder if maybe these rules weren't a joke at all. I folded the paper and stuck it in my desk drawer. Whatever this was about, I'd deal with it in the morning. I'd call Willow, get some answers, and put this whole thing to rest. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept thinking about James's voice on the phone, the fear in it, the urgency, and the way he'd said, "These saved my life" on the note. Saved his life from what? I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows and my alarm was going off. 6 a.m. Time for the morning weather report. I got up and went through my normal routine. Temperature, humidity, wind speed and direction, visibility. Everything normal. Everything exactly like it had been for the past 8 days. But when I was done with the report, I pulled out the sheet of rules and read through them again. In the bright morning light, they seemed absurd, paranoid delusions, the kind of thing someone would write if they'd been alone in the forest too long and started losing their grip on reality. Maybe that's what had happened to James Alvarez. Maybe he'd been up at Cedar Ridge Tower so long that he'd started seeing things that weren't there, started believing in monsters in the woods. I folded the paper and put it back in the drawer. I had a job to do, and it didn't involve following a list of supernatural rules written by someone who was probably having a mental breakdown. I spent the day doing normal tower things, weather reports, scanning for smoke, reading my book. I tried calling the forestry station a couple times to ask about James Alvarez, but nobody answered. Probably busy with other things. The day passed quietly. No strange sounds, no mysterious lights, no voices calling my name. Just wind and birds and the occasional rustle of something moving through the underbrush. By evening, I was convinced I'd made the right choice. The rules were nonsense. James Alvarez was either playing a prank or having some kind of psychological episode. Either way, it wasn't my problem. I made dinner, read for a while, and got ready for bed around 10:30. Normal routine, normal night. At 11:15, I was lying in bed reading when a sound erupted from somewhere outside the tower. It was loud, metallic, like someone ringing a massive bell, but wrong somehow. Harsh and discordant. The sound seemed to vibrate through the steel framework of the tower, through the floorboards, through my bones. I'd never heard anything like it. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering. The sound came again, longer this time. It seemed to be coming from the forest, but I couldn't tell which direction. My first instinct was to get up and look out the windows, to grab my binoculars and try to figure out what was making that noise. But as I swung my legs out of bed, I remembered the rules. Never go outside between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. I wasn't going outside, but looking out the windows wasn't going outside, was it? I stood up and took a step toward the nearest window. I froze halfway to the window. That sound wasn't right, wasn't natural. The ringing cut through the air again, and this time I felt it in my chest. Not like a bell at all, really. More like metal being struck, but wrong somehow. Hollow and sharp at the same time. The kind of sound that made your teeth ache. I stood there in my t-shirt and sweatpants, 1 foot forward, 1 back. Caught between curiosity and something else. Something that felt a lot like fear, though I didn't want to admit that. The logical part of my brain was already working on explanations. Maybe a piece of equipment somewhere in the forest. Some kind of machinery. Hell, maybe someone's car alarm going haywire, though that didn't make much sense either. But the rules James had given me kept echoing in my head. Rule 1. Never go outside between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. Stay in the tower with the door locked. I wasn't going outside, though, just looking through the windows. That couldn't hurt anything. Could it? The sound came again, longer this time, and I stepped back from the window without really deciding to. My bare feet found the cold floor, and I realized I was breathing harder than I should have been. This was stupid. I was 23 years old, not some kid afraid of monsters under the bed, but something about that metallic ringing made my skin crawl, made every instinct I had tell me to get away from the glass. I sat down hard on the edge of my bed and stared at the window. The darkness outside was complete. No moon tonight, no stars visible through the cloud cover, just black glass reflecting the dim light from my reading lamp back at me. I looked pale in the reflection, spooked. The ringing continued, and I started counting. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. It went on for maybe 15 seconds before cutting off abruptly. Then silence. Then another burst, shorter this time. Then nothing. I waited, listened to my own breathing and the usual creaks and groans of the tower swaying in the wind. Normal sounds, familiar sounds, but underneath it all, I kept expecting that metallic ringing to start up again. It did, and this time, I was sure it was coming from multiple directions. That stopped me cold. I'd been telling myself it was some piece of equipment, maybe a broken piece of metal hanging from a tree, clanging in the wind. But this sounded like 3 or 4 sources, scattered through the forest at different distances, all ringing in sequence, like they were answering each other. I gripped the edge of my mattress and forced myself to think rationally. Sound could echo off the mountains, bounce around, and seem like it was coming from everywhere when it really had just one source. That had to be it, some perfectly normal explanation that would seem obvious in the morning. But James's voice kept playing in my head, the fear in it, the urgency. "Your life depends on it," he'd said. 10 minutes. That's how long I sat there on my bed, rigid as a board, while that sound rang out across the forest. Sometimes from what seemed like the north, sometimes the east, sometimes so close I thought whatever was making it might be right at the base of my tower. But I didn't get up, didn't go to the windows, didn't even turn off my reading lamp, though the light made the windows into mirrors and I couldn't see past my own reflection. I just sat there and counted the seconds between each burst of ringing, tried to find a pattern. 7 seconds, 12 seconds, 4 seconds, no pattern at all, which somehow made it worse. When it finally stopped, the silence hit me like a physical thing. My ears rang in the sudden quiet, and I realized I'd been clenching my jaw so hard it ached. I flexed my fingers and found they'd gone stiff from gripping the mattress. I looked at my watch. 11:25. The whole thing had lasted exactly 10 minutes. That couldn't be a coincidence. I got up and walked to my desk, pulled out the paper James had left me, read Rule 1 again. Never go outside between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. Stay in the tower with the door locked. I checked the door, still locked. I hadn't even thought about going outside, really, just looking out the windows. But I hadn't looked. Something had stopped me. Some instinct that told me to step back from the glass. I folded the paper and put it back in the drawer, told myself I was being ridiculous, letting some stranger's paranoid delusions get to me. But when I went back to bed, I left the reading lamp on, and I positioned myself so I couldn't see the windows. Sleep took a long time coming. The next day passed normally. I did my weather reports, scanned the horizon for smoke, ate my canned soup and read my paperback. The morning sun made the previous night seem like a bad dream. Whatever I'd heard, it was probably nothing. Certainly nothing worth losing sleep over. But at 4 o'clock the telephone rang. I was at my desk, updating my logbook with the afternoon weather readings, temperature holding steady at 68 degrees, humidity down to 30%, wind from the northwest at maybe 5 miles per hour. Clear skies in all directions. Normal stuff. Boring stuff, which was exactly how I liked it. The phone rang again, and I picked it up on the 3rd ring. Granite Peak Tower. Static. Loud enough that I had to hold the receiver away from my ear, but underneath the white noise, something else, a rhythmic sound that might have been breathing, slow and deliberate like someone was trying to stay quiet. "Hello?" I said. "Forestry station?" More static, and definitely breathing now. I could hear it in the pauses between the crackling noise, in and out, steady and calm. I thought about Rule 3. If the radio broadcasts voices that aren't from other towers or the forestry station, turn it off immediately. This wasn't the radio, but it was close enough. And whatever was on the other end of this line, it wasn't trying to talk to me. I hung up after 30 seconds. The phone didn't ring again that day. But it did the next day, at exactly 4 o'clock. Same static, same breathing. I hung up immediately this time, didn't even say hello. And the day after that, same thing. 4 o'clock on the dot, like someone was setting a timer. By the third call, my hands were shaking when I picked up the receiver. Not because I was scared exactly, more because the whole situation was getting under my skin. The timing was too precise, too deliberate, and that breathing never changed, never got faster or slower, never paused, just that steady rhythm underneath the static. I started dreading 4 o'clock. Started watching my watch as the minute hand crept toward the 12. Started jumping when the phone actually rang, even though I knew it was coming. On the 4th day, I didn't answer. Let it ring 15 times before whoever was calling gave up. But somehow that felt worse, like I was hiding from something instead of dealing with it. 3 days later, I was eating dinner when I heard voices. Not from the phone this time, from somewhere inside the cabin. I was working on a can of beef stew, reading a detective novel about a private eye in Los Angeles, something mindless to pass the time before bed. The sun had set maybe an hour ago, and I had the cabin lights on, felt safe and normal and boring. Then I heard 2 people talking. I looked up from my book and listened. Definitely voices, muffled like they were coming from another room, but clear enough that I could tell there were 2 of them. A man and a woman, maybe, having some kind of conversation. The problem was, my cabin didn't have another room. It was 12 feet by 12 feet, and I could see every inch of it from where I sat. No closets, no bathroom, no place for anyone to hide. But the voices kept going, and they sounded like they were coming from right behind the wall next to my bed. I got up and walked over there, put my ear to the wood paneling. The voices got clearer, but I still couldn't make out individual words, just the rhythm of conversation, back and forth, like they were discussing something important. I checked the exterior door, still locked, checked the windows, all closed and latched, looked under the bed, though I felt stupid doing it. Nothing there but dust and a paperback I'd dropped a few days ago. But the voices continued. I sat back down at my desk and tried to ignore them. Tried to focus on my book, but it's hard to concentrate on fictional crime when there are real people having a real conversation somewhere in your space, somewhere that shouldn't exist. After maybe 10 minutes, I started picking out actual words. "The Watcher," the man's voice said, clear as day. "When the time comes," the woman replied. I dropped my book. The voices stopped immediately. Complete silence, like someone had flipped a switch. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, waiting for them to start up again. But they didn't. Whatever conversation I'd been hearing, it was over. I thought about Rule 6. If someone approaches the tower at night claiming to be lost or injured, don't let them in or help until morning. This wasn't exactly the same thing, but it felt related. Voices where there shouldn't be voices. People where there shouldn't be people. I forced myself to finish my stew, though it tasted like cardboard. Forced myself to read another chapter of my book, though the words kept jumping around on the page. When I finally went to bed at 10:30, I left all the lights on. The voices didn't come back that night, but I lay awake until almost dawn, listening for them, waiting for that conversation to start up again, wondering what the Watcher meant, wondering who these people were and how they'd gotten inside my cabin without actually being there. When my alarm went off at 6 a.m., I felt like I hadn't slept at all. My hand shook as I did my morning weather report, and I had to read the numbers twice to make sure I'd gotten them right. Temperature 54 degrees, humidity 70%, wind calm, visibility unlimited, everything normal, everything exactly as it should be. Except for the voices I'd heard. The conversation about watchers and timing, the words that had stopped the moment I'd really started listening. I sat at my desk with my coffee and stared out at the forest. 50 miles of trees in every direction, green and peaceful in the morning light. Nothing out there but wildlife and hiking trails and the occasional fire road, but somewhere in all that emptiness, something was watching. Something that knew about the rules, something that was waiting for the right time. I just didn't know what it was waiting for. I'd been following the rules for a week when I saw my first visitor. It was during my evening scan, maybe 20 minutes before sunset. I was doing my usual sweep with the binoculars, checking the horizon for any wisps of smoke or unusual activity. The forest stretched out in every direction, that endless carpet of green that I'd gotten used to. Nothing moved except the occasional bird or the wind through the trees. Then something shifted at the edge of my vision. I lowered the binoculars and squinted toward the tree line. About 200 yards from the base of the tower, where the forest met the small clearing around my structure, a figure had emerged from between the pines. A person standing completely still. I raised the binoculars again and adjusted the focus. It was a woman, middle-aged from what I could tell at this distance. She wore a dark dress that looked old-fashioned, the kind you might see in photographs from decades back. Her hair was pulled back, and she stood with her arms at her sides. She was looking up at me, not just looking in the general direction of the tower, looking directly at my cabin, at the windows where I stood. Even through the binoculars, I couldn't make out her features clearly, but there was no mistaking where her attention was focused. She'd positioned herself in the open space between the trees, and she wasn't moving. My first instinct was to wave. Hell, maybe call out and ask if she needed help. It had been over a week since I'd seen another human being, and the isolation was starting to get to me more than I'd expected. But before I could raise my hand, James's voice echoed in my head. Rule 5. If you see lights moving through the forest, not matching known roads or trails, don't report them. This wasn't lights, but the principle felt the same. Something about not acknowledging what I saw out there. Something about pretending I hadn't noticed. I kept the binoculars trained on her, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There weren't any roads or trails that led to that spot. The nearest hiking path was at least a mile south, and it didn't connect to anything near the tower. She would have had to walk through dense forest to get there, pushing through underbrush and navigating around fallen logs and rocky outcroppings. And she was just standing there, not looking around, not seeming lost or confused, just staring up at my windows with the kind of focus that made my skin crawl. I checked my watch. 6:43. Still plenty of daylight left, so this wasn't about the nighttime rules. But something felt wrong about the whole situation. The way she'd appeared so suddenly, the way she stood so perfectly still, the way she seemed to know exactly where to look. Minutes passed. 5, then 10. She didn't move, didn't shift her weight or adjust her position or show any of the little fidgets that people do when they're standing around. She might as well have been a statue planted there in the clearing. I found myself holding my breath without realizing it. The binoculars were getting heavy in my hands, but I couldn't bring myself to lower them. Part of me wanted to go out onto the catwalk, maybe call down and ask what she needed, but a bigger part of me, the part that had been listening to James's scared voice every night for a week, told me to stay put. The woman's dress fluttered slightly in the evening breeze, confirming that she was real and not some trick of shadows or distance. But everything else about her remained unnaturally still. No movement of her head, no shifting from foot to foot, no gestures or signs of life beyond that dark fabric moving in the wind. I started timing her. 6:43 when I first spotted her. 6:50 when I really started paying attention. 7 o'clock came and went. 7:15. 7:20. My arms were getting tired from holding the binoculars, so I braced my elbows on the window frame. The woman hadn't changed position even slightly. She was like a photograph, frozen in that one moment of looking up at me. This wasn't normal behavior. People didn't just stand in the middle of nowhere for half an hour staring at a fire tower. If she was lost, she would have called out or waved or shown some sign of distress. If she was hiking, she would have moved on by now. If she was injured, she wouldn't be standing so perfectly upright. I thought about the radio, about calling the forestry station to report a possible hiker in distress. But something held me back. Maybe it was Rule 5 playing in my head, or maybe it was the simple fact that she didn't look distressed. She looked purposeful, like she was exactly where she intended to be, doing exactly what she'd come to do. 7:25, 7:30. The sun was getting lower, casting longer shadows across the clearing, but the woman remained in the same spot, in the same position, with the same unwavering focus on my cabin. I started to feel like I was in some kind of staring contest that I hadn't agreed to participate in. Every instinct told me to do something, wave, call out, go downstairs and approach her. But James's rules kept echoing in my mind, and I found myself paralyzed between action and caution. 7:35. I needed to check my watch, just a quick glance to confirm the time. I lowered the binoculars for maybe 3 seconds, looked at my wrist, then immediately raised them again. The woman was gone. I swept the binoculars across the entire clearing, then focused on the spot where she'd been standing. Nothing. No sign that anyone had ever been there. The grass wasn't trampled. There was no indication of footprints or disturbed vegetation. It was as if she'd simply vanished. I kept scanning for another 10 minutes, checking the tree line and the paths leading away from the clearing, but there was no movement, no glimpse of a dark dress disappearing into the forest. She'd been there for nearly 45 minutes and then she wasn't. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about how still she'd been, how focused, and how completely she'd disappeared the moment I looked away. People didn't just vanish like that. Even if she'd run into the trees the second I glanced at my watch, I should have caught some sign of movement when I looked back up, but I hadn't seen anything. 2 days later, it happened again. This time it was morning, maybe an hour after sunrise. I was eating breakfast and doing my routine scan when I spotted movement near the eastern edge of the clearing. A man this time, elderly, wearing what looked like old work overalls and a faded shirt. He stood in almost the exact same spot where the woman had been, and just like her, he was looking directly up at my cabin. I grabbed the binoculars immediately. He was maybe 60 or 70 years old, with white hair and a weathered face. His clothes looked like they belonged on a farm somewhere, not in the middle of a national forest. And he had that same unnatural stillness, that same unwavering focus on my windows. This time I was ready. I timed him from the start, and I made sure not to look away. But after 20 minutes of watching him stand there like a statue, I started to feel that same creeping unease. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how people behaved. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was some kind of local character, someone who lived off the grid and had unusual habits. Maybe there was a cabin or a homestead nearby that I didn't know about. But even as I thought it, I knew it didn't make sense. The Forest Service would have told me about any private property in the area, and besides, there were no roads or trails that would have brought him to that spot. 25 minutes, 30. The old man never moved, never shifted his gaze, never showed any sign that he was aware of anything except my tower. It was like he was waiting for something, but I had no idea what. At 35 minutes, I made the mistake of rubbing my eyes, just for a second, just to clear the strain from staring through the binoculars for so long. When I looked back, he was gone. Same as before. No trace, no sign of movement, no indication that anyone had ever been standing there. The clearing was empty, peaceful, normal. That's when I started trying to call James. I'd been putting it off, telling myself that the rules were probably nonsense and that I didn't need to bother him with questions, but 2 mysterious visitors in 3 days was enough to change my mind. I needed answers, and James was the only person who might have them. The first time I tried, I got no answer. The phone rang and rang, but nobody picked up at Cedar Ridge Tower. I tried again an hour later, then again that evening. Nothing. Over the next few days, I called at different times, morning, afternoon, evening, even late at night. The phone always rang, but James never answered. Either he wasn't there, or he was ignoring the calls. Neither possibility made me feel better. On the fourth day, I decided to try the forestry station. Maybe Willow would know what was going on with the other tower, or maybe she could patch me through to James directly. "Granite Peak Tower to Forestry Station," I said into the radio. "Come in, please." Willow's voice crackled back after a few seconds. "This is Forestry Station. Go ahead, Granite Peak." "Hi, Willow. I've been trying to reach the lookout at Cedar Ridge Tower, but I'm not getting any response. Is everything okay over there?" There was a pause, longer than usual for radio communication. When Willow came back, her voice sounded different. More official, more careful. "Granite Peak. Be advised that James Alvarez abandoned his post approximately 2 weeks ago. His replacement, Jacob Hayes, arrived just a few days ago and is still getting settled." 2 weeks ago. That would have been right around the time James had called me with the rules. He'd given me those warnings, delivered that envelope to my door, and then disappeared. "Did he say why he was leaving?" I asked. Another pause. "Negative, Granite Peak. He left without explanation. Is there something you need assistance with?" I thought about the woman in the dark dress, the old man in overalls, the way they'd both stood so perfectly still while staring up at my cabin. I thought about James's scared voice and his insistence that the rules had saved his life. "No," I said finally. "Just wanted to check in, thanks, Willow." "Copy that, Granite Peak. Forestry Station out." I set down the radio and stared out at the forest. James had abandoned his post right after warning me about the rules. He'd been so urgent, so frightened, and then he'd vanished just like the figures I'd been seeing in the clearing. That evening, I had my third visitor. A young girl this time, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing what looked like a white nightgown. She appeared just as the sun was setting, emerging from the trees on the north side of the clearing. Same spot, same perfect stillness, same unwavering focus on my cabin. But this one was different. This one made my hands shake as I held the binoculars. A child, alone in the forest, wearing night clothes. Everything about it was wrong. If she was real, if she was actually there, then she needed help immediately. She was too young to be hiking alone, too far from any roads or settlements to have wandered there by accident. I found myself standing up, moving toward the door. Every instinct screamed at me to go down there, to help her, to find out where she'd come from and how to get her home safely. But Rule 6 stopped me cold. If someone approaches the tower at night claiming to be lost or injured, don't let them in or help until morning. She wasn't approaching the tower, but the principle was the same. Don't help, don't engage, wait until morning. I forced myself to sit back down, to raise the binoculars again. The girl was still there, still staring up at me. In the fading light, her white nightgown seemed to glow against the dark trees behind her. She looked so small, so vulnerable, and so completely motionless. For over an hour, I watched her stand there. No fidgeting, no looking around, no signs of fear or confusion that you'd expect from a lost child. Just that same statue-like stillness that the others had shown. When full darkness fell and I could barely make out her pale shape in the clearing, I finally looked away to turn on my cabin lights. By the time I looked back, she was gone. 3 visitors in a week, all appearing in the same general area, all exhibiting the same impossible stillness, all disappearing the moment I broke eye contact. And James, who'd warned me about things like this, had vanished just days after giving me the rules. I tried calling the new guy, Jacob Hayes, but got no answer. Either he was still getting settled like Willow had said, or Cedar Ridge Tower had problems that went beyond James's sudden departure. The visits continued. Every few days, someone new would appear in the clearing. A tall figure whose features I couldn't make out, even through binoculars. A woman in a business suit that looked decades out of place. An elderly man with a walking stick who never moved to use it. Each time, I forced myself to watch without acknowledging them. Each time, they stood perfectly still for anywhere from 20 minutes to over an hour. And each time, they vanished the moment I looked away. I started to understand why James had sounded so scared on the phone. These weren't normal people doing normal things. They were something else, something that knew I was up here and wanted me to know they were down there. The question was what they wanted me to do about it. The thing that got to me wasn't the ringing or the phone calls or even the voices in my cabin. It was the timeline. I'd been sitting at my desk for the better part of an hour, staring at the paper James had left under my door. The same 7 rules I'd written in my logbook that first night, typed up neat and clean with his initials at the bottom. But Willow had said James abandoned his post 2 weeks ago, which meant he'd been gone when he called me. That wasn't possible. I'd heard his voice, gravelly, scared, urgent. He dictated those rules word for word while I wrote them down. I could still remember the sound of his breathing, heavy and quick like he'd been running. The way he'd insisted I write everything down because I couldn't trust my memory, the fear in his voice when he said my life depended on it. But according to Willow, James Alvarez had already been gone for days when that call came through. I pulled out my logbook and flipped to that first night's entry. There it was in my own handwriting, 7 rules, exactly as he'd dictated them, except the paper only showed 6. Rule 7 was missing. I'd counted them a dozen times now, running my finger down the typed list. 6 rules, clear as day. But in my logbook, there were definitely 7 numbered entries. The problem was, I couldn't read what I'd written for the last one. The ink looked smeared, like someone had dragged a wet thumb across it before it dried. Just a dark blur where the words should be. I held the logbook up to the light, trying to make out even a single letter. Nothing. It was like the text had been deliberately erased, but I remembered writing it. I could picture myself hunched over the desk, pen moving across the paper as James's voice came through the phone. 7 rules, not 6. What had the 7th rule said? I set the logbook down and rubbed my eyes. Maybe I was losing it. 3 weeks of isolation could mess with anyone's head. Maybe I'd imagined the 7th rule, or written something down wrong in the dark. Maybe James really had only given me 6 rules and my brain was playing tricks on me, but that didn't explain who'd called me that night if James was already gone. The phone rang. I jerked upright, my heart hammering. The sound cut through the afternoon, quiet like a blade. I checked my watch. 2:47, not 4 o'clock. The calls had been coming at different times now, no pattern I could figure out. Sometimes morning, sometimes evening. Always that same static and breathing. It rang again. I stared at the black rotary phone on my desk. Part of me wanted to let it ring, like I'd done that one time, but somehow not answering felt worse than picking up. At least when I answered, I had some control. I could hang up when I wanted. The 3rd ring seemed louder. I picked up the receiver. Granite Peak Tower. Static filled my ear, thick and crackling. Underneath it, that slow, deliberate breathing. In and out, steady as a metronome. I gripped the phone tighter and forced myself to keep listening. Maybe this time I'd hear something else. A word, a voice, anything that might tell me who was calling. The breathing continued. Patient. Like whoever was on the other end had all the time in the world. "Hello?" I said. "Who is this?" More static, but there was something different about it today. The breathing seemed closer, like the person had moved the phone nearer to their mouth. I could hear the slight whistle of air through their nose, the wet sound of lips parting. My skin crawled. I should hang up. Rule 3 said to turn off the radio if I heard voices that weren't from other towers or the forestry station. This had to count as the same thing, but before I could put the receiver down, I heard something else underneath the static. Faint, but definitely there. The sound of metal ringing in the distance. That same hollow, tooth-aching tone I'd been hearing at night, coming through the phone line. I yanked the receiver away from my ear and slammed it back onto the cradle. The dial tone hummed for a second, then went silent. My hands were shaking. The ringing sound was coming through the phone, which meant whoever was calling was somewhere close enough to hear it too. Maybe close enough to see my tower. I pushed back from the desk and walked to the north-facing window. The forest stretched out below me, 50 miles of green emptiness under the afternoon sun. Nothing moved except the wind in the trees. No people, no vehicles, no sign of anyone who might have been making that call, but they were out there somewhere, watching, waiting. I returned to my desk and picked up the logbook again. The smeared 7th rule stared back at me, black and illegible. James had given me 7 rules, I was sure of it, and now one was missing, like someone had deliberately wiped it away. Or something. The thought made my stomach clench. What if the missing rule was the most important one? What if James had tried to warn me about something specific, something that was coming, and now I had no way to know what it was? I thought about the voices I'd been hearing in the cabin, the man and woman having their muffled conversations behind the wall. "The watcher," the man had said. "When the time comes," the woman had replied, and then they'd gone silent the moment I'd shown I was listening. Was I the watcher? Was there a specific time they were waiting for? The sun was starting to sink toward the western mountains. In a few hours, it would be dark again, and with the darkness would come the ringing, the phone calls, the figures standing at the edge of the forest. They'd been appearing every night now, sometimes more than one at a time. Last night I'd counted 3 of them. The woman in the dark dress, an old man in overalls, and someone else I couldn't make out clearly, all standing perfectly still, all staring up at my windows, all waiting for something. I flipped through my logbook, reading the entries from the past 3 weeks, weather reports, routine observations, nothing unusual during the day, but between the lines, I could see the pattern forming. The phenomena were getting stronger, more frequent. The ringing that used to last 10 minutes now went on for 20, 30 minutes at a time. The phone calls that used to come only at 4 o'clock now happened throughout the day. The voices in the cabin were getting louder, clearer. Whatever was happening out there, it was building toward something, and I was missing the one rule that might tell me what to do about it. I set the logbook aside and pulled out the typed paper again. 6 rules, neatly formatted. But looking at it now, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The spacing was off. There was a gap at the bottom, like there should have been more text. Room for a 7th rule. I held the paper up to the light, checking for impressions or faint marks. Nothing. But the gap was definitely there. James had left space for one more rule. So why wasn't it there? Maybe he'd run out of time. Maybe something had interrupted him while he was typing. Or maybe the 7th rule was too dangerous to write down, too dangerous to leave where someone else might find it. I thought about that night, James climbing the stairs to my tower in the dark, the slow, deliberate footsteps I'd heard outside my door. He'd left the envelope and disappeared without a word. No knock, no greeting, like he'd been afraid to make any noise, like he'd been afraid of being heard. The phone rang again. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the receiver before the second ring. Granite Peak Tower. Static. Breathing. But something else too. A faint rustling sound, like fabric moving in the wind. "James?" I said. "Is that you?" The breathing stopped. For a moment there was only static white noise filling my ear. Then, so faint I almost missed it, I heard a voice. Not through the static, but underneath it. A whisper, barely audible. "Don't." The line went dead. I sat there holding the receiver, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The voice had been distant, distorted, but it sounded like James, the same gravelly tone I remembered from that first night. Don't what? Don't answer the phone? Don't follow the rules? Don't trust what I was seeing? Or don't look for the seventh rule? I hung up the phone and stared out at the forest. The sun was lower now, maybe an hour from setting. Soon it would be dark, and the real strangeness would begin. The ringing, the figures, the voices in my cabin, discussing things I wasn't supposed to understand. But tonight felt different. The missing rule, the phone call, the whispered warning, it all felt like pieces of something larger coming together. Like whatever had been building these past 3 weeks was finally ready to happen. I just didn't know what it was. I pulled out a pen and opened my logbook to a fresh page. If I couldn't remember the seventh rule, maybe I could figure it out. The other 6 had all proven accurate. They'd kept me safe so far. There had to be a pattern, a logic to them. Rule 1. Stay inside between 11 and 5. Rule 2. Don't respond to voices calling my name. Rule 3. Turn off strange radio transmissions. Rule 4. Don't use the firefinder at night. Rule 5. Don't report unusual lights. Rule 6. Don't help nighttime visitors. All of them were about not engaging, not responding, not acknowledging what I was seeing and hearing. Like the things in the forest fed off attention, off interaction. The moment I broke that barrier, the moment I acknowledged them directly, something bad would happen. So what would the seventh rule be? What was left to warn me about? I wrote down possibilities. Don't leave the tower. Don't look directly at them. Don't say their names. But none of those felt right. They were too similar to the other rules, too obvious. James wouldn't have needed a separate rule for something that basic. The seventh rule had to be different, more specific, more urgent, something about timing maybe. When the time comes, the woman's voice had said, maybe the seventh rule was about recognizing when that time arrived, when whatever was building finally reached its peak. Or maybe it was about what to do when the other rules weren't enough anymore. I looked at the paper again, at that empty space where the seventh rule should have been. James had left it blank for a reason. Either he couldn't write it down or he didn't want to. Either way, I was on my own. The sun touched the mountain peaks. In 30 minutes, it would be dark. I closed the logbook and walked to the north window. The forest looked peaceful in the fading light, but I knew better now. Things were moving out there. Things that didn't follow normal rules. Things that knew I was up here and were waiting for the right moment to act. Tonight, I had the feeling, might be that moment. The tremor started 3 days after I couldn't read the seventh rule. Just a slight shake in my right hand when I reached for my coffee mug that morning. I figured it was too much caffeine, maybe not enough sleep, but by the next day, it had spread to both hands, and writing the weather reports became a challenge. My handwriting, usually neat and precise, turned into something that looked like a child's scrawl. The numbers wavered across the page. Temperature readings that should have been clean, straight lines became shaky approximations. I had to grip the pen harder, concentrate on each letter, but that just made the tremor worse. The appetite went next. Food started tasting like cardboard, then like nothing at all. I'd open a can of soup, heat it up, take 3 spoonfuls, and push it away. My stomach felt like it was tied in knots, constantly churning even when empty. The smell of anything cooking made me nauseous. I lost weight I couldn't afford to lose, my clothes hanging looser each day. Sleep became a joke. I'd lie in bed, exhausted but wired, listening to every creak of the tower, every whisper of wind through the trees. My eyes would burn with fatigue, but the moment I started to drift off, I'd jolt awake, certain I'd heard something, a footstep, a voice, the beginning of that metallic ringing. The phenomena weren't letting up. If anything, they were getting stronger, more persistent, like something was building toward a deadline I didn't know about. The ringing now lasted 30, sometimes 40 minutes. It would start just after 11 and continue well past midnight, those hollow, tooth-aching sounds echoing from different points in the forest. I'd stopped trying to count the intervals. There were too many sources now, too many voices in that metallic chorus. Sometimes it sounded like a conversation, different tones answering each other from the darkness. The phone calls came at random times now, 2 in the morning, 7 at night, 3 in the afternoon. Always the same static, the same deliberate breathing, but lately there had been other sounds underneath. Whispers I couldn't quite make out, the distant sound of that ringing. Once, I swear, I heard my own voice echoing back at me, saying words I'd never spoken. The voices in the walls had gotten bolder too. Last night, I'd heard what sounded like a full conversation happening just on the other side of the wood paneling. A man and woman discussing something in urgent, hushed tones. I could almost make out individual words, but when I pressed my ear to the wall, they'd stop immediately, like they knew I was listening. And the figures. God, the figures. What started as 1 or 2 visitors had become a nightly gathering. Every evening, as the sun touched the mountains, they'd begin appearing at the edge of the clearing. The woman in the dark dress was always first, taking her position near the north tree line. Then the old man in overalls would emerge from the east, the girl in the nightgown from the south. But now there were others. A tall figure in what looked like a military uniform, standing so still he might have been carved from stone. A woman in clothes that belonged to a different century, her dress reaching the ground, her hair pulled back severely. An elderly man with a walking stick he never used, just held at his side like a prop. Last night I'd counted 7 of them, 7 figures arranged around the clearing in a rough circle, all facing the tower, all staring up at my windows with that same impossible stillness. They'd stood there for over 2 hours, never moving, never shifting position, until full darkness fell, and they vanished one by one. I'd tried radioing for help, contacted the forestry station twice, asking if there had been any reports of missing persons in the area, any hikers who might have gotten lost. Willow's voice came back confused, asking if I'd seen someone who needed assistance. How could I explain that I'd seen 7 people standing motionless in a clearing for hours, people who disappeared the moment I looked away? How could I tell her about the rules, about James's warning, about the things that shouldn't exist but clearly did? I couldn't. I'd sound insane. Hell, maybe I was going insane. The isolation was getting to me in ways I hadn't expected. 3 weeks ago, I'd enjoyed the solitude, found it peaceful. Now it felt oppressive, like the walls of the cabin were closing in. The forest that had seemed beautiful and serene now felt hostile, full of watching eyes and hidden threats. Every shadow could be hiding something. Every sound could be the beginning of something worse. I'd considered leaving. More than once I'd looked at my truck keys hanging by the door and thought about packing up, driving down that winding mountain road and never looking back. But every time I reached for them, I'd remember James's voice on the phone, the fear in it, the urgency. The 7th rule was missing for a reason, and if I left without knowing what it was, would I be walking into something worse? The rules had kept me safe so far. I was sure of that now. The tremor in my hands, the knots in my stomach, the sleepless nights, they were all proof that something was wrong here, something that went beyond normal human experience. The rules weren't superstition or paranoia. They were a survival guide for something I didn't understand but couldn't ignore. 21 nights I'd been following them, 21 nights of staying inside after 11, of not answering voices that called my name, of keeping the firefinder covered during the dark hours. 21 nights of watching figures appear and disappear, of listening to sounds that had no earthly source, of answering phone calls from people who shouldn't be able to reach this number. Tonight felt different though. I couldn't put my finger on why, but there was something in the air, a tension that made my skin crawl. The sun had set an hour ago, and the first figure had already appeared. The woman in the dark dress, taking her usual position. but she seemed closer tonight, maybe 50 yards from the tower instead of her usual 100, and she wasn't alone. As I watched through my binoculars, the old man in overalls emerged from the tree line, then the girl in the nightgown. One by one, they took their positions, but all of them were closer than before, tightening the circle around the tower. By 9 o'clock, there were 6 of them visible, and I had the distinct feeling they were waiting for something. I forced myself to eat half a can of beans, though they tasted like paste and sat heavy in my stomach. I tried to read, but the words swam on the page, my eyes too tired and strained to focus. The tremor in my hands made holding the book difficult anyway. By 10:30 I was exhausted, but knew sleep wouldn't come easily. I went through my nightly routine, brushing my teeth, changing into my sleeping clothes, checking that the door was locked. The figures were still out there, still maintaining their vigil, but something about their arrangement had changed. They'd moved closer again, close enough that I could make out details of their clothing, the expressions on their faces. They were all looking directly at my window, all of them. And for the first time since this started, I thought I saw one of them smile. I turned off the lights and climbed into bed, but sleep felt impossible. My nerves were too frayed, my mind too active. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the silence, waiting for the metallic ringing to begin. It didn't come. For the first time in 3 weeks, 11 o'clock passed without that hollow, discordant sound echoing from the forest. Midnight came and went in complete silence. I should have been relieved, but instead I felt more anxious than ever. The absence of the familiar horror felt worse than its presence. I must have dozed off sometime after 1 in the morning, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in darkness, my heart pounding, certain that something had disturbed my sleep. I lay still, listening, trying to figure out what had woken me. The cabin was quiet. No wind outside, no creaking of the tower framework, just silence. Then I realized what was wrong. Someone was breathing in the room with me. Slow, steady breaths that weren't mine, coming from somewhere near the foot of my bed. My blood turned to ice. I didn't move, didn't even dare to breathe, just lay there listening to the rhythmic sound of someone else's respiration in my locked cabin. Very slowly, I turned my head toward the foot of the bed. A figure stood there in the darkness, tall and gaunt, wearing clothes that hung loose on his frame. Even in the dim light filtering through the windows, I recognized him from the personnel photo I'd seen at the forestry station. James Alvarez. But this wasn't the James from the photograph. That man had looked middle-aged, healthy, with kind eyes and a slight smile. This James looked like he'd aged decades in the weeks since that photo was taken. His cheeks were hollow, his hair completely gray, his skin pale and drawn tight over his skull. And his eyes. His eyes were completely black, not just the pupils. The entire visible portion of each eye was black as coal, reflecting no light, showing no trace of humanity. "You should have left," he said, but his voice didn't come from his mouth. It came from everywhere at once. The walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath my bed. It echoed inside my skull, reverberated through my bones. I felt it more than heard it. I tried to speak, to ask him how he'd gotten in, what he wanted, but no sound came out. My throat had closed up completely. "The 7th rule," James continued, his black eyes fixed on mine. "You needed to know the 7th rule." He stepped closer to the bed, and I could see that his feet made no sound on the wooden floor. He moved like he was floating, gliding through the air rather than walking. "Never sleep in the tower after midnight on the new moon," he said, his voice still coming from everywhere except his mouth. "Tonight is the new moon. You should have left hours ago." The new moon. I'd lost track of the lunar cycle, too focused on surviving each night to pay attention to the broader patterns. But he was right. Tonight was the new moon, the darkest night of the month. "I tried to tell you," James said, and for a moment his voice sounded almost human, almost sad. "I tried to warn you, but they wouldn't let me write it down. wouldn't let me say it clearly. Some things can only be learned too late. I found my voice finally, though it came out as barely a whisper. What happens now? James tilted his head, and I realized his neck bent at an angle that wasn't quite right, like it was broken. Now? He said. Now they come for you. I couldn't move. James stood there at the foot of my bed, his head tilted at that impossible angle, and I felt like my whole body had turned to stone. The words, "Now they come for you," kept echoing in my skull, bouncing around like they were looking for somewhere to land and make sense. But nothing made sense anymore. James took a step closer to the bed. That's when I saw his feet weren't quite touching the floor. He hovered maybe an inch above the wooden planks, and when he moved, there was no sound at all. No creak of old boards, no shuffle of shoes, just this awful silence that pressed against my eardrums. "You should have left hours ago," he said, and his voice came from everywhere at once. The walls, the ceiling, the space behind my eyes. Before the moon went dark. I tried to speak, but my throat felt like I'd swallowed sand. Finally managed to croak out, "How was I supposed to know?" James smiled then, and I wished he hadn't. His mouth stretched too wide, showing teeth that were all wrong. Too many of them, too sharp, arranged in rows that went back farther than any human mouth should allow. "The rules were never meant to save you," he said. "Just to buy you time. Time to figure it out yourself." That's when I heard them. Footsteps on the metal stairs outside. Slow, deliberate, climbing up toward my cabin. But these weren't like the footsteps I'd heard before, when James had left the envelope. These were wrong somehow. Too heavy. Too many of them. I counted as they climbed. One set, then another, then a third. The woman in the dark dress, the old man in overalls, the girl in the nightgown. All of them coming up to my door, and I knew with absolute certainty that they weren't going to stop outside this time. James's form started to blur around the edges like he was losing focus. His face began to shift and change, features sliding around like they weren't quite fixed in place. The hollow cheeks got deeper, the black eyes bigger, until they took up most of his face. "Run," he said, and for just a second his voice sounded almost human again, almost like the scared man who'd called me 3 weeks ago. "Run now, while you still can." The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. I heard them moving around on the catwalk circling the cabin. Slow, patient steps that seemed to be testing each section of metal grating, looking for another way in maybe, or just letting me know they were there. I forced myself to sit up in bed. My whole body felt like it was made of lead, but I swung my legs over the side and stood on shaking knees. James watched me with those terrible black eyes, his form getting more and more transparent, like he was fading away, or like whatever was keeping him here was running out of power. "Where do I go?" I whispered. But James was already gone, just empty air where he'd been standing, and the sound of something scratching at my door. The scratching wasn't frantic or desperate. It was methodical, deliberate, like fingers running along the wood, testing the strength of it, finding the weak spots. I could hear them moving around the door frame, and then the scratching moved to the windows. I grabbed my keys from the desk. They were right where I'd left them, next to the radio and the logbook with all those useless weather reports. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped them twice, but I managed to get them into my pocket. The radio. I should take the radio. Willow would want to know what happened, and I'd need some way to explain why I was abandoning my post in the middle of the night. Some story that wouldn't get me committed to a psychiatric ward. I snatched the radio off the desk and clipped it to my belt. The scratching at the windows was getting louder now, more insistent. I could see shapes moving past the glass, dark silhouettes that blocked out the starlight. They were all around the cabin, pressing close to the windows, looking for a way in. The door handle turned. I'd locked it. I knew I'd locked it, same as every night for 3 weeks. But the handle was turning anyway, slow and steady, like whoever was on the other side had all the time in the world. That's when my paralysis broke. I bolted for the door, reaching it just as it started to swing open. I slammed my shoulder against it, forcing it closed, and turned the lock again. But I could feel pressure from the other side, steady and patient, like they were just waiting for me to get tired. I couldn't stay here. The door wouldn't hold them forever, and there were too many of them. The woman, the old man, the girl, and God knew how many others. All of them wanting something from me, and I was pretty sure I didn't want to find out what. The windows. They were testing the windows now, and I could hear the metal frames starting to rattle. Not like they were trying to break the glass, but like they were working the latches. Patient and methodical, just like everything else they did. I backed away from the door, keys clutched in my sweating palm. The truck was 70 feet down at the bottom of the tower. 70 feet of open metal stairs with nowhere to hide and nowhere to run except straight down. But it was the only way out. The window latch on the north side clicked open. I ran for the door, yanked it open, and burst out onto the catwalk. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and sharp, and I could smell something wrong in it. Something like old meat and wet earth and things that had been buried too long. The stairs stretched down below me, disappearing into darkness. My truck sat at the bottom, just barely visible in the starlight. 70 feet. I could make it in maybe 30 seconds if I ran. I started down, taking the stairs 2 at a time, my bare feet slapping against the cold metal grating. Behind me, I could hear them coming out of the cabin. Not running, not hurrying, just following at that same patient pace they'd used to climb up. 10 feet down, 20. The truck was getting closer, but so were the sounds behind me. Footsteps on metal, but wrong somehow. Too light for the old man, too heavy for the girl, like they weren't quite solid anymore, or like they were changing into something else as they followed me down. 30 feet, halfway there. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like rubber, but I kept going, had to keep going. The keys were cutting into my palm where I gripped them, but I didn't dare loosen my hold. That's when I heard the sound that wasn't quite human. It came from above me, from the direction of the cabin. A voice that might have been the woman in the dark dress, but stretched and distorted like it was coming through water. It was trying to say something, trying to form words, but the sounds that came out were all wrong. Too many syllables, too many consonants, like a mouth that wasn't built for human speech. I looked back over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. They were following me down the stairs, but they weren't people anymore. Not really. The shapes were wrong, stretched and twisted like shadows that had been pulled out of their proper proportions. The woman's dress flowed around her in ways that defied gravity, and the old man's overalls hung loose on a frame that seemed to be collapsing in on itself. But it was the girl that made me stumble and almost fall. Her white nightgown was clean and bright in the starlight, but her face was gone. Just smooth skin where her features should have been, like someone had erased them with a giant thumb. 40 feet down, 50. The truck was right there, maybe 20 more steps. I could see the door handle, could see my salvation waiting in the darkness. Just had to make it a little farther. The thing that used to be the girl made a sound like wind through broken glass. It echoed off the metal framework of the tower, bouncing back and forth until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The other things answered it, their voices joining together in a harmony that made my teeth ache. 60 feet, 10 more steps, 5. I hit the ground running and sprinted for the truck. The keys were ready in my hand, and I jammed them into the lock without slowing down. The door opened and I threw myself inside, slamming it behind me and hitting the lock button. The engine turned over on the first try, thank God. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the base of the tower and the narrow dirt road that led back to civilization. I threw the truck into reverse and gunned it, not caring about the trees or the ditches or anything else except getting away from this place. In the rearview mirror, I could see them at the bottom of the tower. They'd stopped following me, but they were watching. Standing in a loose circle around the base of the metal framework, their impossible forms perfectly still in the red glow of my taillights. I spun the wheel and pointed the truck down the mountain road. The headlights swept across pine trees and rocky outcroppings, picking out the familiar landmarks I'd seen on my way up here 3 weeks ago. The road was narrow and winding, but I knew every curve now. I'd driven it enough times in my head, planning my escape. The speedometer climbed past 40, past 50. Too fast for this road, especially at night. But I didn't care. I had to get away from the tower, away from whatever those things were, away from the rules that had kept me alive just long enough to learn the truth. Behind me, the tower disappeared around a bend in the road, but I could still feel them watching, still feel their attention like a weight on the back of my neck. They weren't following me, but they knew where I was going. They'd always known. The radio crackled to life on my belt, static at first, then that familiar breathing sound I'd heard so many times over the past 3 weeks. But underneath it, I could hear something else. Voices, multiple voices, all talking at once in languages I didn't recognize. I reached down and turned the radio off. Whatever they wanted to tell me, I didn't want to hear it. The mountain road stretched out ahead of me, winding down through the darkness toward the main highway, 20 miles to the nearest town, to gas stations and street lights and people who'd never heard of 7 rules or things that weren't quite human. I pressed the accelerator to the floor and drove into the night, my hands shaking on the steering wheel and my heart hammering against my ribs. In a few hours, the sun would come up and this would all seem like a nightmare. But right now, in the darkness between the trees, I knew it was real. I'd learned the 7th rule just in time, and I was never going back to find out what would have happened if I hadn't. I'd been back in Millfield for 3 months when I finally worked up the nerve to fill out college applications. Sitting at my old desk in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the same baseball posters and model airplanes I'd left behind, I felt like I was playing dress-up in someone else's life. The community college acceptance letter had come 2 weeks ago. Nothing fancy, just the local school where half my graduating class had ended up. But it was a start, and it was paid for with the money I'd saved working construction that summer after I came down from the mountain. Clean money, honest work that didn't involve watching horizons or following rules that made no sense until they saved your life. I never collected those fire lookout wages. Never even called the Forestry Service to ask about them. Willow probably had paperwork sitting on her desk somewhere, wondering what happened to the kid who just vanished from Granite Peak Tower without a word. Maybe she'd sent someone up to check on the place. Maybe they'd found my logbook still sitting on the desk, open to the page where I'd tried to write down 7 rules and only managed 6.5. I hoped whoever went up there followed basic safety protocols, went during daylight, didn't stay past sunset, didn't answer any phones that might ring at strange hours. The desk lamp cast a yellow circle over my application forms, and I filled in the blanks with careful handwriting, name, address, previous education, simple questions with simple answers. Nothing about supernatural encounters or rules that kept you alive in places where normal logic didn't apply. The forms didn't have boxes for that kind of experience. My mom called up the stairs that dinner was ready, and I set down my pen. The house smelled like pot roast and mashed potatoes, normal food that tasted like something instead of cardboard. I'd put back the weight I'd lost during those final weeks in the tower, and my hands had stopped shaking sometime in October. Small improvements that added up to feeling human again, but some things hadn't changed. I still woke up most nights around 11:15, listening for metallic sounds that never came. Still found myself counting intervals between normal household noises. The refrigerator cycling on, the furnace kicking in, my dad's footsteps in the hallway. 7 seconds, 12 seconds, 4 seconds. Looking for patterns that weren't there. The phone rang downstairs, and I tensed before I could stop myself. Just my mom answering, talking to my aunt about Thanksgiving plans. Normal conversation between normal people about normal things, but I'd started checking the clock whenever our phone rang, noting the times. Never 4 o'clock exactly, thank God. That would have been too much. I went downstairs and sat at the kitchen table where I'd eaten thousands of meals growing up. My parents chatted about their days, Dad's work at the hardware store, Mom's shift at the hospital, ordinary problems with ordinary solutions. No one mentioned my summer job or why I'd come home early and refused to talk about it. They'd learned not to ask. "How's the college application coming?" my mom asked, passing me the potatoes. "Good. Should have everything submitted by next week." "What are you thinking for a major?" I'd been avoiding that question for weeks. Before the tower, I might have said forestry or environmental science, something that would get me back outdoors, maybe working for the Park Service or forest management. Now the idea of spending my career in wilderness areas made my stomach clench. Business, maybe, or accounting. Dad nodded approvingly. Practical choice. Always going to be demand for people who can handle numbers. Practical. Safe. Indoor work with fluorescent lighting and climate control. No horizons to scan, no weather reports to file, no radios crackling with voices that shouldn't exist. I could spend 40 years in an office building and never once wonder what was watching me from the tree line. After dinner, I helped with dishes and went back upstairs. The application forms waited on my desk, half finished. I sat down and picked up my pen, then stopped. The weight felt familiar in my hand. Not quite the same as the pen I'd used to write down James's rules, but close enough to bring back that night when everything started. I'd never figured out what happened to James Alvarez. The real James, I mean. Whoever had called me that first night with the 7 rules, whoever had left the typed paper under my door, that hadn't been the thing I'd seen standing at the foot of my bed on the new moon. That had been something else wearing his face, using his name. But someone had tried to warn me. Someone had known what was coming and had done their best to prepare me for it, even when they couldn't speak or write the most important rule directly. The 7th rule that would have saved me from spending that last night in the tower if I'd known it from the beginning. Never sleep in the tower after midnight on the new moon. Simple words that would have changed everything. But some warnings, apparently, could only be learned too late. Some knowledge had to be earned through experience, through following the first 6 rules long enough to survive until the 7th one mattered. I finished the application and sealed it in the envelope. Tomorrow I'd drive to campus and submit it in person, maybe take a tour of the facilities, see the classrooms where I'd spend the next 2 years learning about profit margins and tax codes instead of fire behavior and forest management. The career counselor would probably ask about my interests, my goals, what I wanted to do with my life. I'd give him the standard answers about stability and opportunity. I wouldn't mention that my main goal was finding work that didn't require me to be alone in remote locations after dark, that my primary interest was staying alive in a world where some places followed different rules than others. My phone rang. The cell phone I'd bought after coming home, since I'd never trusted landlines quite the same way. I checked the time before answering. 8:37. Safe. "Tommy?" My friend Jake from high school. "Hey man, want to grab a beer tonight? Some of the guys are meeting at Murphy's." Normal invitation from a normal friend to do normal things with normal people. 6 months ago, I would have said yes without thinking. Now I had to consider the logistics. Murphy's stayed open until midnight on weeknights. I could go, have a couple drinks, be home by 11 easy. "Yeah, sure. I'll meet you there in an hour." "Cool. See you then." I hung up and looked at my reflection in the dark window. 23 years old, back living in my childhood bedroom, enrolling in community college like I was starting over. Which, in a way, I was. Starting over with knowledge I wished I didn't have, with experience I couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't lived through it. But I was starting over. That was the important part. I was alive to make new plans, to choose a different path, to build a life that didn't involve watching horizons for smoke, or listening to radios for voices that shouldn't exist. I grabbed my jacket and headed downstairs. My parents were watching television in the living room, some cop show where the good guys always won and the mysteries always had rational explanations. "Going out with Jake," I told them. "Have fun," my mom said. "Drive careful." "I will." I would. I'd been driving careful for 3 months now, checking my mirrors more often than necessary, avoiding mountain roads even when they were shorter routes, taking the long way around to stay on main highways with plenty of traffic and good lighting. Murphy's was exactly what I needed. Bright, loud, full of people I'd known since kindergarten. We talked about football and jobs and who was dating whom, normal conversation that didn't require me to think about rules or warnings or things that watched from forest edges. I nursed 2 beers over 3 hours and was home by 10:45, safe in my childhood bedroom before 11, before the time when strange sounds used to start. I brushed my teeth and changed into pajamas and got into the same bed I'd slept in through high school, but I didn't sleep right away. I lay there listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling, the wind in the oak tree outside my window, the distant hum of traffic on the highway, peaceful sounds from a peaceful place where the worst things that happened were car accidents and domestic disputes and teenagers drinking in the park. Sometimes I wondered if I'd imagined it all, if the isolation and stress had gotten to me, if I'd had some kind of breakdown that turned normal forest sounds into something supernatural. But then I'd remember the feeling of those things watching me, the wrongness in James's black eyes, the way my own voice had echoed back at me through the phone. You didn't imagine that level of detail. You didn't hallucinate something that specific and consistent. I'd survived something real, something that had rules and patterns and a purpose I'd never understand, something that had been waiting for the right conditions. The new moon, the midnight hour, a lookout who'd followed the first 6 rules long enough to be worth claiming. But I'd gotten out. I'd learned the 7th rule just in time, and I'd run, and I'd made it to my truck and down the mountain and back to the world where things made sense, where phones rang at normal times and people stayed where you could see them and metallic sounds had logical explanations. I pulled the covers up to my chin and closed my eyes. Tomorrow, I'd submit my college application and start building a life that kept me far away from wilderness towers and the things that lived in the spaces between the rules. I was grateful to be alive, grateful to have choices, to have a future that extended beyond surviving until sunrise. Whatever had happened to James Alvarez, whatever had claimed other lookouts before me, it hadn't gotten me. The rules had saved me, even the incomplete set, even when I'd only learned the most important one at the last possible moment. And I'd never forget that some warnings should be heeded no matter how impossible they seemed. Some rules existed for reasons you didn't need to understand, only follow. Some knowledge was worth having even when you'd rather not know it was necessary. I was alive, and I was safe, and I was never going back to find out what I'd escaped from. That was enough. That was everything.